The heavy oak doors groaned as Elon Musk pushed them open, the sound echoing in the cavernous silence. The church was empty. Why was a man like Elon Musk alone in a place like this? Not where you'd expect to find him, this man of technology and boundless ambition. Yet, there he was, the soles of his shoes clicking on the stone floor as he stepped inside. A faint scent of incense lingered in the air, mingling with the chill that seemed to rise from the ancient stones. He stopped halfway down the aisle, his breath catching in his chest. "Why am I here?" he whispered to himself. Not a rhetorical question. He genuinely didn't know. For months, something had been tugging at him, an inexplicable pull toward this moment, this place. His gaze swept over the rows of wooden pews, each as lifeless as the next, until it landed on the crucifix above the altar. The figure of Jesus gazed down at him, serene yet piercing. What was it about that crucifix that made him feel so exposed? His knees buckled, and he sank into a pew, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in decades, the ever-confident Elon Musk felt small. The weight of his doubts, his triumphs, his failures, it all bore down on him. And then he heard it. The pounding of his own heart filled Elon's ears as he sat frozen in the pew. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, a figment of his imagination, an auditory trick brought on by stress or exhaustion. But the weight of the voice he'd heard remained heavy and undeniable, like a hand pressed firmly on his chest. "Why do you doubt?" The words echoed back at him, haunting and relentless. They were soft, almost gentle, but imbued with an authority that demanded his attention. Elon's rational mind fought to make sense of it, but the church around him seemed to grow colder, as if challenging him to deny what he'd heard. The crucifix above the altar drew his gaze like a magnet. The carved figure of Jesus, arms outstretched, seemed different now. There was something alive in the eyes, something watching him. The silence stretched, thick and unnatural. Slowly, he forced himself to his feet. The air seemed heavier as he moved, as if the very atmosphere was pushing back against him. Each step toward the altar felt like a trial. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice bouncing off the stone walls. It sounded too loud, almost intrusive. He swallowed hard, waiting for a response. Nothing. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty pews, the shadows stretching across the floor. No one was there, but the feeling of presence was undeniable. He wasn't alone. "Why do you doubt?" The words came again, this time louder, spoken with clarity and purpose. Elon's body stiffened and he spun around, searching for the source. His breath quickened and his rational mind began to rebel. This was impossible. He was alone in the church, wasn't he? "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling now. "If you're real, show yourself." Nothing stirred. The stillness of the church remained unbroken, but the silence felt alive, as if it were waiting for him to understand something he couldn't quite grasp. His eyes were drawn back to the crucifix. The figure of Christ seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The wood almost glowed with an otherworldly warmth. Elon's legs felt weak, but he forced himself to approach the altar, step by trembling step. "You've built your life on answers," the voice said again, this time closer, clearer. "But not every question has one." The voice wasn't coming from outside of him. It was resonating within, as if it were bypassing his ears entirely and speaking directly to his soul. He clutched the back of a pew for support, his knuckles white. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The voice didn't respond immediately, but a strange warmth began to spread through him, starting in his chest and radiating outward. It wasn't comforting, not exactly. It was challenging, like it was peeling back layers of armor he hadn't even realized he was wearing. "You've touched the stars," the voice continued, steady and calm, "but you've ignored the ground beneath your feet." Elon blinked. The words struck a chord deep within him. He thought of all he'd achieved, all the accolades and advancements, the world-changing ideas that had come to fruition under his leadership. But beneath it all, there had always been a restlessness, a nagging sense that no matter how far he went or how much he accomplished, something was missing. "You're not making sense," he said, shaking his head. "I've done more than most people could ever dream of. I've pushed boundaries. And yet you doubt," the voice interrupted, gentle but firm. "You doubt your purpose. You doubt the source of your gifts. You doubt me." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Elon felt exposed, as though every secret, every fear he'd ever tried to bury was now laid bare. The warmth that enveloped Elon didn't dissipate as he knelt there, trembling before the altar. If anything, it grew stronger, surrounding him in a cocoon of light and silence that defied explanation. He should have been afraid. His entire life had been dedicated to unraveling the mysteries of the universe with logic and reason. But nothing about this moment could be explained. And yet, he felt no fear, only a profound, inexplicable awe. How does a man of science reconcile with a truth that transcends it? What are you saying? He asked, his voice raw. That everything I've done, it doesn't matter. The warmth around him seemed to intensify, not in judgment, but in compassion. It matters, the voice said gently, but not in the way you think. Elon shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. I don't understand. What more am I supposed to do? What is it that I'm missing? The crucifix above the altar seemed to shimmer again, and for the briefest moment, it was as if the figure of Christ turned its gaze directly toward him. Elon gasped, the intensity of the moment overwhelming. He looked away, tears streaming down his face, though he couldn't explain why. You are not the creator, the voice continued, unrelenting yet kind. You are a vessel. Through you I have given gifts to the world, but you've used them to glorify yourself, not the one who gave them. Elon's heart clenched. The words cut deeper than he thought possible. He had always prided himself on his achievements, on the empire he had built with his own 2 hands. But as the voice spoke, a painful truth began to take root in his mind. He had been searching for fulfillment in the wrong places. What do you want from me? He whispered. The words were simple, but they carried a power that was undeniable. Elon's mind raced, trying to grasp their meaning, to see. To see what? To see beyond yourself. To see the purpose for which you were created. Could Elon accept a purpose that was bigger than his own ambitions? The warmth around him began to shift, and suddenly he was no longer in the church. The stone walls and wooden pews faded away, replaced by a blinding light that stretched endlessly in every direction. Elon's breath caught in his throat as he realized he was standing in the midst of something beyond comprehension. In the light, images began to form, faces, places, moments frozen in time. He saw the people he'd helped, the lives that had been touched by his innovations. But then the images shifted, and he saw the faces of those he hadn't reached, those who had been left behind in the wake of his relentless drive for progress. The weight of it all was unbearable. He fell to his knees again, tears streaming down his face. I thought I was doing good, he said, his voice cracking. I thought I was making a difference. You have, the voice said, calm yet firm. But you've only begun to scratch the surface. There is more to be done, more than you can imagine. The light around him began to dim, and slowly, the church came back into focus. Elon found himself kneeling before the altar once more, the warmth still lingering, but the overwhelming presence beginning to fade. He felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, confusion, and a growing sense of purpose that he couldn't yet fully understand. Whatever had just happened, it had changed him. And though he didn't have all the answers, he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice cracking. I don't even know why I'm here. Because you were called, the voice replied simply. Elon staggered backward, his mind reeling. He didn't believe in this, any of this. He wasn't the kind of man who sought out divine intervention. His life was built on facts, on logic, on equations that could be proven. But as he stood there, staring at the crucifix, he felt something undeniable stirring within him. He sank to his knees before the altar, his hands shaking. I don't understand, he said, tears pricking his eyes. I've done everything I thought I was supposed to do. Why do I still feel like it's not enough? The silence in the church seemed to shift, wrapping around him like a comforting embrace. And then, for the first time, the voice spoke with unmistakable clarity. Because you were made for more. Elon's breath caught. The words pierced through him like an arrow. The weight of them was overwhelming. And yet, they carried a strange sense of peace, as though he'd been waiting to hear them all his life without realizing it. Who was speaking to him, and what did they mean by more? The stillness of the church felt different now. It wasn't empty, it was alive, charged with an energy Elon couldn't explain. As he knelt there, trembling before the altar, the warmth that had enveloped him began to settle into something deeper. It wasn't gone, it had simply become a part of him, like a quiet flame burning in his chest. He stayed in that position, unsure of what to do next. Everything he thought he knew about the world, about himself, had been turned upside down. He was a man of logic and reason, but this was beyond logic. It was undeniable, yet impossible to define. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, his legs feeling unsteady, as though they didn't belong to him. He glanced at the crucifix, half expecting it to shimmer again, but the figure of Christ now seemed still, serene. The church was silent, but it wasn't empty. He could feel the presence still lingering, watching, waiting. What was expected of him now that he had been given this vision? Elon turned and began walking down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stay still. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he had just experienced. The images he had seen, the faces of people he had helped, and those he hadn't, it all swirled together in a chaotic storm. As he reached the heavy oak doors of the church, he stopped. His hand hovered over the handle, but he didn't push it open. Something held him back. "You are not the creator, you are a vessel." The words echoed in his mind, more powerful now than they had been moments ago. He closed his eyes, gripping the door handle as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. The vision had been clear, crystal clear. He had been given gifts, abilities that few others had, but he had used them selfishly, without understanding their true purpose. Was it too late for him to change? With a deep breath, he let go of the door and turned back toward the altar. His footsteps felt heavier this time, as though the weight of his realization was bearing down on him. When he reached the altar, he sank into a pew, his hands clasped tightly together. For the first time in years, he prayed not a rehearsed prayer, but an honest plea from the depths of his heart. "What do I do now?" he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but he knew the question didn't need to be loud to be heard. "How do I make this right?" The silence stretched out, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with a sense of expectation, a call to action that he couldn't ignore. And then the vision returned, not in the same overwhelming light as before, but as an acquired certainty in his mind. He saw himself standing before crowds, not as a billionaire or a tech mogul, but as a man with a message. He saw himself sharing what he had experienced, not to glorify himself, but to inspire others. He saw the ripple effect it would create, the lives that would be touched, the hope that would spread. The night air was cool against Elon's face as he stepped out of the church, the heavy oak doors closing behind him with a resounding thud. The world outside was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was a stark contrast to the whirlwind inside his heart. He stood on the church steps, staring out at the empty street. The vision he'd seen moments ago still burned in his mind, himself not as the inventor or businessman the world knew, but as a messenger, a man driven not by ambition, but by faith. It felt like a challenge, a call to let go of the identity he'd spent his entire life crafting. The thought terrified him. How does a man who built his life on control embrace the uncertainty of faith? Elon sat down on the stone steps, his head in his hands. The enormity of what he'd been shown pressed down on him like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. For years, his achievements had been his armor, his proof to the world that he mattered. Now that armor felt hollow, like a shield made of paper. "Why me?" he murmured aloud, his voice breaking the silence of the night. Why not someone who already believes, someone who knows what they're doing? The answer didn't come in words, but in the quiet stillness around him. The presence he had felt in the church was still there, gentle but insistent, urging him to trust what he couldn't yet see. For a long moment, he simply sat there, wrestling with his doubts. Finally, he closed his eyes and did something he hadn't done in decades. He prayed. "God," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm the right person for this. But if this is really your plan, if this is what you want from me, show me how. Help me see what I'm supposed to do." The words felt strange on his lips, awkward and unpolished, but they were honest. And in that moment, honesty was all he had to give. Would his prayer be answered, or would he be left to face this alone? When he opened his eyes, the streetlights seemed brighter, the wind a little warmer. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. He didn't have a clear roadmap or a sudden revelation, but he felt a quiet reassurance, like a hand on his shoulder. He stood, brushing off his pants, and began to walk. His steps were slow and hesitant at first, but with each one, a sense of determination grew within him. He didn't have all the answers, but he didn't need them, not yet. For now it was enough to take the first step. As he walked, his mind began to race again, this time not with doubts but with ideas. How could he share his experience in a way that people would understand? Would they even believe him? And more importantly, how could he reach those who needed to hear it most? His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw a message from one of his assistants, a reminder about an upcoming presentation to investors. He stared at the screen for a moment, the familiar pull of his old life tugging at him. For years, he had poured himself into his work, convincing himself that his success would bring him the fulfillment he craved. But standing there on the cusp of something greater, he realized how empty those victories had been. They were nothing compared to the peace he had felt in the church, the warmth of that presence that had spoken to him. He put the phone back in his pocket and continued walking. This time he knew where he was headed, not to a boardroom or a laboratory, but to the people. The vision had been clear. He was meant to share his story, to use the platform he had built not for his own glory, but for something far greater. Would the world accept his message, or would they turn away? The thought scared him, but it also drove him. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to follow a path he hadn't charted himself. Elon's steps carried him home in the quiet hours before dawn, but his mind was anything but quiet. The prayer he'd whispered outside the church echoed in his heart, each word grounding him as he prepared for what lay ahead. For so long he'd been the architect of his own story, but now, for the first time, he felt like he was being written into something far greater. By the time he reached his home, the first light of morning was creeping over the horizon. He stepped inside, the quiet hum of the house greeting him. Normally he would have gone straight to his study, diving into emails, schedules, and plans. But this time he walked past it all, straight to the small sitting room he rarely used. He sat down in the armchair by the window, his gaze drifting to the sliver of sky visible beyond the city's skyline. His phone sat heavy in his hand, a reminder of the world waiting for him, the world he now felt called to reach. Would he be brave enough to speak the truth, knowing it might cost him everything? The vision he'd seen in the church came flooding back, standing before crowds not as a billionaire or an inventor, but as a man with a story to tell. He'd spent his entire life building machines, pushing boundaries, striving for progress. Now he was being asked to build something far more fragile: faith. He opened his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. Where would he begin? How could he even explain what had happened without sounding unhinged? The world knew him as a man of logic and science, someone who solved problems with equations and ingenuity. How could he make them believe in something that defied all of that? The answer came quiet but sure: start with the truth. Taking a deep breath, he began to type. The words came slowly at first, but soon they flowed freely, as though they had been waiting to be released. He didn't overthink it, he simply wrote what was on his heart. When I walked into the church that night, I was a man with questions no amount of success could answer. But I left with something I never expected: clarity. I heard a voice, not in my head but in my heart. It told me I was made for more, that all I've achieved is nothing compared to the purpose I was created for. And for the first time in my life, I felt peace. He paused, his hands trembling. Would people believe him? Would they mock him? He didn't know, but he realized it didn't matter. This wasn't about his reputation, or even his legacy. It was about the message. Could this simple message inspire millions to listen, or would it fall on deaf ears? With a final deep breath, he hit send. The message was out there now, beyond his control. He leaned back in his chair, the first rays of sunlight spilling over his face. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time he was okay with that. Because this wasn't about him, it was about something far greater than himself. And that was all the clarity he needed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its warm glow across Elon's sitting room. He sat motionless in the armchair, staring at his phone, the message he'd sent still fresh on the screen. The silence around him felt heavier now, not with doubt, but with anticipation. The hours passed. The first notifications began to trickle in. A handful of responses turned into dozens, then hundreds as his message spread. Some were supportive, others skeptical, and many more dismissive. But among the noise, there were voices of hope, messages from people who shared their own struggles, their own doubts, and their gratitude for his courage to speak. Elon scrolled through the responses, his heart swelling with a strange mix of humility and purpose. He wasn't sure how his story would be received by the world at large, but it was already clear that it had touched lives. And that was enough. Could this be the beginning of a movement greater than he had ever imagined? As the days turned into weeks, Elon began to speak more openly about his experience. He granted interviews, not as the brash innovator people had come to expect, but as a man transformed. He shared what had happened in the church that night, the vision that had changed him, and the new sense of purpose driving him forward. He spoke not about religion in a traditional sense, but about faith in something greater than oneself, faith in the gifts each person is given, and the responsibility to use those gifts for good. His words were met with mixed reactions. Some embraced his message, others ridiculed him, and many questioned his sincerity. But he didn't let the doubt deter him. One evening, weeks after he first shared his story, He found himself in a packed auditorium. The crowd before him wasn't there for a product launch or a scientific breakthrough. They had come to hear his story, to find inspiration in his journey. Elon stepped onto the stage, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces. "I'm not here to preach," he began. "I'm here to share what I've learned. I spent my life chasing answers, trying to understand the universe through science and reason. But the greatest truth I've discovered is this: we are more than what we create. We are created for a purpose." The room was silent, the audience hanging on his every word. Elon continued speaking from his heart, unpolished. When he finished, the applause was thunderous, but he barely heard it. His focus wasn't on the reaction, it was on the message. As he stepped off the stage, he felt a quiet peace settle over him. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. That night, back in the solitude of his home, he knelt by his bed for the first time since that moment in the church. He prayed aloud, "God, I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'm strong enough to do what you've called me to do, but I trust you. I trust that you'll guide me even when I don't understand. Thank you for giving me this purpose. Help me to walk this path with courage and humility." Amen. As he rose, a quiet strength filled him. The journey was far from over, but he was ready to take the next step, wherever it might lead.